inevitably. So that's my presentation. I'm looking for your comment. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Zheng. Professor Zheng Anting, thank you. Now, ladies and gentlemen, I have here in my hand our handbook, and if you turn to page 19, you would find the name Professor Zheng, okay? And if you scan this QR code, you would have the entirety of his presentation. Likewise, for all our other speakers, so you don't need to take photos, okay? Just scan the QR code, it's all there. Words, pictures, and everything. So, ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming our moderator, Professor Lin Jianyuan, on stage. Thank you, our applause. Our moderator, our chair. Welcoming our presenter, Professor Jin Jiahe, please, on stage. Welcoming Professor Chen Jianyuan, please, on stage. And Professor, again, Zheng Anting, on stage. And of course, Dr. McCarthy. We need you on stage as well. Thank you. Our applause to our moderator and our presenters and discussants. Can we have a photo before we start? Yes. Each panel has a photo. This is the panel group photo. Yes. Okay, thank you, thank you. Our moderator, our chair, Professor Lin, you have the floor. Once again, ladies and gentlemen, please, our applause.
Okay, thank you very much. Okay, again, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I think first of all, I have to say congratulations to the Institute for the happy anniversary, 50th. This is quite important to me myself either, right? I'm not sure if I told you before. Actually, I was the alumni of 21st regular session. And that was the year 1978. So that says that 40 years ago, I was very young. Anyway, I'm so happy to be in this occasion. Now, thank you for the presentation of the three speakers. They all have introduced the overall picture of the planning system in Taiwan. I have to say that Professor Lin Ziqing planned this or organized this conference very, I have to say that, but carefully and by all the knowledge. This morning, we talk about the land, agricultural land. So think about the national development, and 50 years ago, and Taiwan was in such, very agricultural-based economy. So that means a lot for the agricultural land reform. And then to pursue it, or for better economic development. And then you have to pursue it for the industrialization. And then, of course, you have the problem, how to meet the demand for urbanization and housing infrastructure, all those contains. And how to deal with that. And then comes the issue about how can we come up with a good or ideal planning system to guide the urban development, the infrastructure, and then to control the land use, and then, of course, to get the adequate funding for that. Okay, so you have got such, and like Antin has introduced, in the process of economic or security industrialization, national economic development plan is more important than the land use plan itself. So you'll see that the industrial land or industrial zone, industrial park, are led and developed by the national institutes. So that's all the way these three gentlemen, they try to explain. You have the urban land, and then you have the planning system, and then you introduce the readjustment program so that even though the city government do not have adequate funding for that, but still you can promote the urban development. But still, the national government is working very hard for the economic development, so they introduce the industrial park system like that. So after these three presentations, now we like to invite George, Mark. It's your turn to make your comments. It's very important for your comments. because you're going to stimulate their thinking and their questions.
Okay, well, thank you, John. So, you know, I think that it's really interesting to kind of reflect on the development of land policy in Taiwan, because, you know, just to put it into context, starting in about 1950, they were developing a system while they're actually doing other things. So you're building a plane while you're flying it. And you have to really appreciate that, because then you'll understand why it is that adjustments are constantly being made as new kind of mandates or new kind of contextual issues kind of arise, right? But, you know, as I've been reading these papers, and I've really learned a lot about kind of land policy and its evolution in Taiwan over the last 50 years, I had to reflect back to graduate school where in the 1980s we're all obsessing about the Asian tigers. And one of the things about the Asian tigers, you know, Taiwan, Hong Kong, South Korea, and Singapore, was that everybody was trying to explain their phenomenal growth, particularly during the 1980s, and everybody talked about it as, you know, policy-led growth through import substitution and then through export-led growth, right? But nobody ever talked when I was in graduate school about what they did on the land. And it struck me when I was thinking about this that those four countries have about as aggressive a state policy towards land as almost any countries in the world. The state, while it doesn't necessarily have a spatial plan, the state has a lot of influence on land use. The central government has a lot of influence on land use, much more than in a place like the United States, where land use kind of follows the market more than it follows the mandates. And, you know, what's interesting about that is that in many cases, the land use had to kind of navigate between different kinds of challenges that were going on at different times. One, when in 1950, when all of a sudden you're bringing all these immigrants from mainland China, all of a sudden you have another, you know, 1.5 million people coming in to occupy what? No housing, no place to go. And so they had to find a way to both house people, feed people, and then start to build an economy around all these new people. And they needed to very quickly increase domestic output. And part of that plan was, all right, we're going to increase domestic output. What is the strategy? We're going to find ways to substitute for inputs. So we're not going to substitute for any imports. So we're going to find ways to start to build everything ourselves, light industry. And so the first effort was to figure out how we're going to motivate people to do light industry and at the same time begin to urbanize. And so the early land use planning was all about motivating that to happen. And as they motivated that to happen, they had to also think about other kinds of mandates, like military mandates. You know, you look at Taiwan in 1950, and there were two military targets. There was Taipei and Kaohsiung. And then they had to decide, well, could we afford to be that vulnerable? And of course they couldn't, so now they had to motivate people to build new towns. Well, how are you going to motivate people to build new towns? You need to have methods for those things to happen. And so, you know, Taiwan created what I consider to be a really interesting and adaptive land use planning system that started with these kinds of mandates and then the ability to learn. And as they learned, they adjusted. And that's really something that I think is quite extraordinary, because all along the way, they still try to maintain a focus on a set of principles that guided those land use, like the principle of being able to defend property rights, the principle of trying to find the right kind of land use tools and taxation processes to maintain some level of equity, and also to find ways to make sure that they don't create in their own policies too many winners and losers, right? So one of the things about the mandates when they began, you know, with import substitution and light industry, they succeeded very rapidly, more rapidly than I think anybody expected. And as soon as they succeeded with import substitution, they realized all of a sudden they opened up the opportunity to do export-led growth and to start to build heavy industry. Then as soon as they started to build heavy industry, where they needed a place to put heavy industry, so they decided to start to build these industrial parks. Now, you know, you would seem to be kind of ad hoc and piecemeal, but in some ways it was guided by macroeconomic forces, guided by demographic forces, and guided by kind of the needs of the population that these things happened. And then after, you know, heavy industry was going really well, what happens? Well, you get the oil crisis. The oil crisis comes and you realize, oh my God, we have to do import substitution again. We have to find a way to do industrial production without using as much energy. let's upgrade our industry, and let's find ways to be more efficient and more technologically innovative. And then, moving after that back to export orientation with high tech. And every one of those transitions was done almost seamlessly, and every one of them underneath it was a different kind of land use that kind of took place. So this is all happening also in an era where Taiwan didn't have a lot of resources. They depended for 15 years on gigantic flows of capital from the United States to help them to begin to build the industrial economy. But local government had almost no resources. And the national government is telling the local government, all right, look, we want you to go and now plan your cities. We want you to designate parts of your cities for public facilities. We want you to expropriate the land. And based on our Constitution, when you expropriate the land using eminent domain, you got to pay people for the land. Well, of course, local government didn't have any money. What are they going to do? How are they going to pay for the land? So what they did was they reserved the land for that particular use, and they said, we'll pay you later. And they said, well, when? What's later? Well, 10 years from now. And after 10 years, well, give me 5 more years, right? And what they realized is that they needed another way to really develop that urban land without the financial resources to actually pay for the roads and the sewers and all the other public facilities that they needed to run the cities. So what did they turn to? They turned to an old model that they'd used before because they'd actually used land readjustment to create Kaohsiung in 1937, right? That was a Japanese model, but it was a model that they understood. And if you don't understand land readjustment yet, let me just give you a quick 3-part version of what land readjustment is, because in some ways it sounds like alchemy, where you turn lead into gold, right? So with land readjustment, you take land that's not very well organized, and you get all the landowners to agree to pool their land together. They pool their land together, and then a plan is devised to now plat out the land and organize it in ways that you could actually put in infrastructure, and then after the infrastructure is put in, you can reallocate the land that is now organized urban land as opposed to disorganized, whatever, rural or suburban land. And the key to urban land readjustment is that the value of the land, when you move it from being disorganized and not serviced by infrastructure to being organized and serviced by infrastructure, is that the value goes up substantially. It goes up so much that you can actually take the land of the people that pooled their land and give them back less than half of what they contributed, and they still are happy because the value of the land they get back is much higher than the value of the land they contributed. And it leaves more than half of the land to use for other purposes, and those other purposes are what? Public facilities, roads, infrastructure, green space, public parks. And Korea, Taiwan, Japan, no place do they do land readjustment kind of better, because they used it as a prominent way to be able to spur urban land development without money, because the urban land development was paid for by the land. And that's why I mean there's kind of an element of alchemy there, because you say, well, where did the money come from? And of course, where the money came from was after the land was developed, after the land was serviced and plotted out, and after half of it was given back to the other owners, the part of the land that wasn't used for public facilities was sold, and sold at substantial profit, and that was the money that was used to actually pay for the infrastructure. And it's been done, in many, many places. It's been done at least more than 50 times in Seoul, Korea. But Taiwan used it very well, and they used it to overcome that problem where you wanted to do urban development, you wanted to finance infrastructure, you wanted to you modernize your economy, and you didn't have any money. Now, I think there's probably, of 191 countries in the world, 120 countries who could probably use that, including Afghanistan, which is using it, right? And there's certainly, other, there's other countries like in Latin America that have been using it as well, that aren't necessarily poor, but can certainly find ways to add infrastructure. So not only are you building new tools, building new cities, you're also building institutional structures to support long-term planning. And so the master planning, the detailed plans, these all are kind of created as a way to organize yourselves and then to create kind of the authorities and the ways that people are responsible for overseeing land. And originally it was set up with 3 layers of government. You had local government, provincial government, and national government. The national government would review the master plans, the provincial government would look at the detailed plans, and the local government would implement. And of course, over the period of time, you realize at some point that intermediate government was irrelevant. And so, in a very smart way, you just did away with it. So somewhere, and I forget when it was, like 2002 or something, they said, you know what, we don't need provinces anymore. So we sent the detailed plans down to local government. We make the master plans at the national level review, and everybody's happy and moving along. And that's part of being adaptive and building the plane as you fly it. But you also did some other kind of simultaneous problem solving, because you found ways to incorporate new mandates. One of the first mandates for the national government was the mandate to deconcentrate population and create the new cities. But another was, well, how about protecting rural land? How about protecting vulnerable environmental land? And all of a sudden, little by little, new pieces are added to the land use planning to then kind of accommodate those things. But of course, every time you accommodate one thing, you create another kind of problem. And one of the things that you accommodated around the turn of the millennium was the need to democratize the planning process through public participation. But as soon as you open it up for public participation, what do you get? NIMBYism, right? And one of the things that you realize is that the order that you do things sometimes matters, and NIMBYism becomes a big obstacle for the places that were slow at developing their public places. And now they had to go through a much more arduous public process. And so it became a little bit more complicated. And then finally, you know, and the thing that I find really, really amazing is that, you know, the alchemy of urban land readjustment works really well when you're developing new areas. But it's not necessarily as good a tool when you're trying to redevelop areas that are already developed. And the process can be undone in many different ways. And certainly one of the ways the process is undone is if you require unanimous consent from the landowners, because one holdout can prevent a whole area from being redeveloped. But then I think the government overshot, because they said, all right, forget it, we don't need to have unanimity. We only need to have more than 50% of the landowners agreeing to do this. And next thing you know, you get corporate interests coming in and basically doing kind of you know, mergers and acquisitions and taking over whole areas of the city to do redevelopment. And so I think that right now, Taiwan's in a very interesting spot, because what you've done is you've tested a bunch of tools, you've tested a bunch of approaches, you've been able to adapt to environmental, macroeconomic, other kinds of changes, but you're now into a very new era. And it's a new era that's not any different from the new era that faces most of us. The era of aging population, slowing population growth, and changing demands for land use. One of the things that characterized Taiwan at the early days when you're doing your industrial land development was you thought that industrial land would be industrial land forever. And now all of a sudden you realize, oh, wait a minute, industrial land that was used for industrial land for long periods of time now has to be used for a different purpose. Like the refining plant in Kaohsiung, which is a big piece of land, but it looks like it's going to have to be cleaned up if you're going to use it for something else. And now you're going through what every other you know, developed economy goes through. How do we reinvent ourselves, and how do we change and redevelop land that's been used for different purpose? My guess is that you're not going to be able to use the old tools. Land readjustment is not going to work for redevelopment. Other kinds of expropriation and participatory processes might be necessary, but it's going to be a very different challenge in finding a way to bring together the forces that you're going to need to now reposition Taiwan as a developed country with developed country problems is going to be the next generation of land use challenges. But I have to say, like I said, I found the papers to be really interesting and stimulating, and it helped me to kind of fill out the picture of how Taiwan, over the period of about 50 years, goes from 23% urban to 90% urban, to go from, you know, most of the population working in agriculture to almost none of the population working in agriculture, to massive, you know, growth of new cities and all the other challenges that go with it. But I think that, you know, it's an impressive body of work that shows how an attentive government can actually adapt to the new challenges and find ways to recreate its own processes, its own institutions to make land use consistent with the needs of the population going forward. So thanks for the papers, and I really appreciate the chance to read them.
Thank you very much, Mac. That's a very interesting summary. I found out you have summarized the 3 papers in a very organized way. At least I think people should understand more and better. So thank you for that. Especially I have to echo that George at the end of his summary. He said that if looking back 50 years, you have such issues. But you look ahead 50 years, then you have a totally different picture and you have a totally different challenges. See, at the very beginning you have planning because you have you want to have economic growth, you want to have industrialization, and you have more population, things like that. And now the problem is that you have economic restructuring or even declining. And even you have the decreasing of the population. So I mean, you have to reverse the mind of planning. Before you have to forecast how to increase, accommodate the increasing. And now you have to think that how to accommodate the decreasing. So that's very challenging. Now we have 20 minutes, right, left for this session.
I think yeah.
Should be. So we have 20 minutes. So we open to the floor and then back to the speakers and discussion. So any questions? Okay, Jim, please.
Real quickly, do I need a mic?
Yeah, I think so. So people can hear you.
Oh, there's one here.
There's one.
Oh, here we go.
Okay.
You know, just a really quick observation and question, and it kind of follows on the comments, and that is that we see as I travel through the cities in the region, but also back home, and that is we see much of the older housing that we put in, what would correspond to the 1950s and 60s, et cetera, is now in a state of serious deterioration. And we're going to have to, all of our country is going to have to be addressing how do we take existing buildings in the center of cities and revitalize them with all the property relationships that we have. And I think this is going to be a challenge into the future. So we're going to have to replace them to meet new housing standards, because now we have housing has to be built better to withstand the changing climate, et cetera. New amenities, people don't want to live the way they did in the 1950s, 60s. And health and safety factors. And now we realize that we have big changes coming in our neighborhoods and the way we want our neighborhoods organized, health, bicycling, walking, et cetera. So I just want to ask that how people here are thinking about how you're going to take this existing housing stock and somehow involve the owners in a revitalization.
So question goes to? All right, so all you three. So, I'll ask Professor Jin to answer first.
The city is going forward. I think that's correct. And then the people living in the older buildings, they need to remodelize or reorganize their need to their futures. That's correct. And then we trying to make some policy or some instrument to encourage people to rebuild their building. We call urban regeneration. But the maybe the deputy mayor will be some experience talking about a lot of story about urban regeneration. Actually, it's quite hard to doing all those things because you try to force people living there very familiar environment. Actually, there was kind of different opinion, and the Taiwan, they try to use encouraging methods because of their right now we call democracies. We must listen to the people's opinions, but they're always their opinions again. I against doing this, doing that, but I also ask the government doing this, doing that. But when the government want to move into their house, they're just against that. So maybe deputy mayor will give us some suggestions.
So, Chen?
I think just because as the judge said, urban land real adjustment maybe is not so thought apply in the old neighborhood. Maybe it's more suitable for the new urban district development. Of course, right now, just like in Taipei, we face the huge problem about urban regeneration because we expect the Asian people, maybe they will like to live in the countryside, a very beautiful green. But we finally find that old people still like to live in the city areas because it is closer to the hospital. So we have more and more people just concentrated in the urban. So we also have designed a new institution to speed up the urban regeneration, but we also face the similar problem about to calculate the majority vote. So majority is 100%, then we'll have the whole problem. So if we lower, so in the past years, we have a low threshold of doing the urban regeneration, so we also have created the conflicts, just like we have seen in the urban land readjustment. So right now, we just rise up a little bit, and we also engage a lot of the rise up the agreement threshold. Also, we find another incentives to spur up the landowners that want to participate, just like give them more flower areas, and maybe we will provide more economic incentive to attract more developers or landowners to voluntarily to participate. But also the environmentalist also will protest. Maybe the urban capacity maybe cannot afford anymore, but some people maybe support the urban can afford it. So it will become another, yes, we have to admit another the very serious public debate in this issue and a very important challenge in the very near future of Taiwan. I believe so.
Right. Today my topic is about industrial development. So I think that also following the previous two speakers, I also say something happened about the industrial regeneration in industrial park. Actually, this morning I remember George asked me a question, said how you government to promote the industrial upgrading, but I answered that it's very difficult actually because after government decides industrial park, actually they sell the land to a private sector. So that means a government only have the authority to monitor, but lost the authority to ask them do some change. And what James' questions about residential areas also happening in industrial park. Today, we see a lot of industrial park with very old buildings and very old factories, and some industrial park actually still be concerned about the security and the safety problem. However, the government facing difficulty to push them to change. So that's why we need a white paper. White papers can be solutions for industrial land and try to make all this together to make governments have some authority, and the land use policy play a big role inside, and the government have the right to take back the land if you don't do this. If you don't do this, for example, don't do the regeneration projects of industrial park. So I think this is what happened in Taiwan about the regeneration in industrial park. So can I have 1 minute to answer the questions about George about the change of industrial land. Actually, I agree with George said we need to change because it's inevitable we need to have an institutional adjustment as time. However, the example I like to set in Kaohsiung seems different. Is very different from what we said. We all agree that if the city expands, some industrial park need to be changed for other use because for the bigger city. However, the reality is in Taiwan, many industrial parks be converted to other use, not because of the growth of population, but because of the property price, the growth of property price. So in this case, I think that the lack of special plans make this city expansion very unreasonable, and this make residential land, residential use and the commercial use invade to the land in different land use. I think this is a problem, and our government is conducting this problem very hard.
Okay.
So one of the other things, Jim, is that the government has recently defined assisted living as a public facility. And so the lands that they reserve for public facilities that haven't been developed can be developed for public facilities for assisted living, right? And now the folks who would give up their flats to move into assisted living leave those flats to be redeveloped. And so to the extent that you could do that strategically and then be able to assemble properties that can be redeveloped, then the government can play a role in helping to assist that. And then there's also the reuse of some of the public lands that were partially developed, like schools that were never used. And we heard about the adaptive reuse of some of that as well. So there is that opportunity. And one of the things about population shrinkage that it begins to give you room to do things differently, and especially if people want bigger places, then the apartments in Taipei are very small, right? And so to the extent that now all of a sudden you could accommodate larger places with the shrinking population, that gives you again the opportunity to kind of rebuild, right? But that's always done incrementally. And one of the things we always know in cities is we're always occupying a built environment that was built for somebody 50 years ago, right? And now we're just trying slowly to kind of adapt that to our current uses. It takes a little while.
So Jim, what you ask is a very interesting question, but seems that the answer is quite difficult. Even there's no answer for that. But that's really interesting, because if you look at the, say, the fourth generation of new town developed 50 years ago, now it's abandoned. The central Taiwan, the so-called the Zhongxin Xinchun, the previous provincial government location, now it's totally abandoned. So it totally have different challenges for the urban redevelopment or the urban regeneration. So now we have a different, 50 years land, now we have to deal with all new difficulties. And my understanding for this, my observation, all right, we say that there are many reasons make that even more difficult than other countries. Number one is that the property right system. We have the private property, and forever. See, once you buy this plot of the land, then you have the ownership forever. It's very different from, I know that in other countries like China or where else. So they have a certain period of time. Now here, forever. Because it's forever, so it's really difficult to ask them, to give up. And the value is always increasing. So that's number one. The property right system is very protective to the private owners. That's number one. And second is that I think in Professor Jin's presentation, the last page, right? And he pointed out, is your presentation or Professor Chen, pointed out that to encourage people to join the land readjustment or to encourage people to join the urban redevelopment, then you have the so-called the threshold. Say you have to, at least you have to get 2/3 of the owners to agree with the redevelopment project. And that was before. And now in Taipei City, they ask, you should have 100%. Say, this area, all the private owners, you have to get the agreement from 100% of all these owners. And you can imagine how difficult for that. So that's the ownership problem first. And secondly is that there are also the administration, or we call it the transaction costs. For example, before we thought that was very progressive, okay? So we have set up all kinds of regulations to protect the old trees, to protect all buildings, okay? And every tree, just like we human being, every year they have 1 year, their age increased by 1 year. So by Taipei City's regulation, once a tree age over 30, then it's on the list of trees to be protected. See? And we are talking about 50 years of land reform. So you can imagine that how difficult to get the permission for the redevelopment, and also not only all the trees, but also all the buildings, these kind of things. So that, all these things make the regeneration very, very, very difficult. So I don't know what to do. So maybe this is one of the issues others can share or help us to find the solutions for that.
You know where they'll get the revenue to redevelop the urban areas is by taxing all those people living in farmhouses who don't pay any property taxes. So you get some new revenue to help to do the redevelopment of older urban areas, right?
So thank you, George. So you are saying that in next session, they're going to provide us two solutions. That's good. Okay. Okay. So is there? If not, since we have only 3 minutes left, I've each one appoint 1 minute, okay, to conclude your presentation and also the echo to George's comments. So should we go start? Okay, Professor Chen.
Okay, 1 minute. I'd just like to say is even over the last 70 years, even we facing a lot of difficulties because thanks for support from the different corners in the world, we suffer, but we pass, and we come here then successfully. And looking for the next 50 years, I think with our organization and with the Lincoln Foundations, I think that we have the confidence to overcome every difficulty in the future. So, thank you.
Okay, it's very efficient.
Thank you. I think thank you for Judge the comments. Yes, we just right now we face the problems that many developed countries right now has also encountered. So we in the past maybe 50 years we are poor. We are desperate in need for economic development. So we just developed so many institutional economic plan or industrial park. But right now we have faced another problem. Maybe we got rich, so we got some capitals. They don't want to go to the productive use. They want to do the more speculative use. So we right now have faced lots of problems about land speculation in urban area, industrial land, to doing something, not doing industrial land. In that industrial land use, we also had lots of the land readjustment, not for real actual demand, but for maybe the kind of the financial goods. So I think that also we also have faced another maybe the Taiwan and China. In the past, that we have a Taiwan and China, the military threat. Right now we have faced another threat. Maybe we'll distract our government attention to focus on the politics rather than economic development. So maybe we'll have faced another second round of tension, and we also have to refocus on the real economic development. That's my reflection. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Chen?
Thank you very much. Thank you, George McCarthy. The summary and the comment about the topic about Taiwan's urban development. We know we have facing a lot of issues in the futures, and especially just talking about urban regeneration. I think they have another kind of issue I didn't mention about, because we find the young person, they don't like to make marriage, don't like burn their children, and they even don't like the buying a house in the city. They want to live in with their parents. So there's another issue we need to dealing with in the near future. And lastly, as I say, the city is moving forward. It is a process. There are a lot of issues we need to face, and that's the reason why the urban planner or the urban administrator or officials, they need to take all those issues they're facing in the near future. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Professor Chen. So, Mac, you'd like to summarize and point out challenges for the next 50 years.
I have the last word at the end of the day.
Okay, so if not, then I have 1 minute either, right? Okay. Let's say that, how to say that? 50 years of the planning system in Taiwan, and I have to say that our system is by no means perfect. Okay, so even ourselves, we feel that we have a lot of things to do and to improve. And the thing is that planning system is not some kind of innovation. You can have it at once or a new one. You look at the history of the planning system in Taiwan, it's a kind of hybrid, I call it a hybrid system. You see, essentially you have all the land laws from mainland China, which was made in 1935 in mainland China. Okay, and before that, we have the planning system from Japan. Because in 1925, Japan has implemented the urban planning law, and so at that time, Taiwan was part of Japan, right? So Taipei, Kaohsiung, and other cities, they did their urban planning, all the ways like a Japanese regulation. And then suddenly you come up with the Chinese land right system. And then we have, after Second World War, and then we have people who go to UK, like Professor Chen, and some people go to United States. And at that time, we have the so-called the UN advisory group from United States. So we have tried to import or to learn all the planning system from United States. And then since there is no, uniform solution for that, so we have part from UK, part from United States, and part of still we learn from Japan, and we have, how you call this, like a puzzle, and put it together and then come up with the existing system. And we don't like it, but how can you do it? That's the historical development, so we have to just take it. But the thing is that now we know that there are a whole bunch of problems, and now we have to face, if you look at 50 years later, then we have totally new challenges, which is totally different, like technology, like the value. See, Professor Chen says that the young generation has totally different perception of what is a good city from ours. And also the land use changes so fast. If you look at those innovative workshops or land uses outside, they may just exist for 3 or 5 years. Totally new. So you need to have a planning system which is flexible and to be able to accommodate innovative and temporary uses and even safe. And then also to deal with the resilient city, things like that. So there are really big challenges for us. So I'm saying that we not only need land reform again, we need the planning system reform either. And I'm looking forward to that. And thank you very much for your attention. Thank you.
Thank you to our moderator, our presenters, and our discussant. Ladies and gentlemen, let's take a coffee break now. This is the next issue we're facing. Take a coffee break for around about 10 minutes, okay? Thank you. Enjoy your coffee break. And please leave your blessings and words in our memo book. Memo book is right next to our dessert area. In addition to the souvenirs of cultural specialty from all of our participants of regular sessions, if you've noticed, there are candies, there are cookies, there are bonbons. They're all yours to take away. Souvenir table, bonbons, candies, cookies. Thank you. We come back in around about 10 minutes. Thank you very much. Our moderator for this panel 3 is Professor Steve Choi. Please welcome Professor Steve Choi. He's our moderator, our chair. And we have our presenter here as well, Professor Lin Ziqing. Professor Lin. Thank you. And Professor Wu Wenjie, Professor Wu. And Professor Yao Minghong, Professor Yao. Thank you. Our 3 presenters. And we have our discussants, Professor Roy Bal. Thank you, sir. He's right here. And we have Professor Gary Cornea, right here. And now, ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming our presenter for Paper 6, Valuation for Taxes on Real Property. Our presenter, Professor Lin Ziqing. Professor Lin, thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the session. I'm Ziqing Lin from National Zhenjiang University. I was told I only have 15 minutes, but being a professor, my minimal time for a talk is 15 minutes. So I'll try to cut it down. And this session is the topic I believe that not many people will feel interesting, because when I was a student, the land taxation is a class I try to avoid, but I'm teaching the class now. So my topic is about valuation for taxing land and the buildings. Okay. I will try to tell you why land is treated quite differently in Taiwan, why we care so much about land. And I will briefly explain how our tax system on land buildings was invented in the first place. After that, I will reflect on our experience and try to provide a number of recommendations for ourselves and for the rest of the world. These are photos you have seen many times. And the idea of taxing land in Taiwan was greatly influenced by the classical economist David Ricardo, and also the social reformer in the United States, Henry George. Both of the two persons actually influenced the founding father of the Republic of China very much, the Dr. Sang Yan-hsian. Dr. Sang Yan-hsian read their works and was very much convinced by their ideas. So Dr. Sang Yan-hsian proposed the idea of equalization of land rights. Equalization of land rights argue that the value of the land that is not contributed by the private individuals should be taken back primarily through taxation to the society and to be enjoyed by the society as a whole. These are not only ideas, dead ideas. Actually, they are ideas, they are concepts also endorsed by the economists in modern times, such as Professor William Vickery, Milton Friedman, and Lowell Harris, who I actually have the honor to meet. So those figures actually influence our thinking about land very, very much. So Taiwan is probably one of the few countries that we truly believe the land value should be an issue that we take seriously, and we should, through the taxation, through the legislation, to share the fruit of the progress of the society. So we have fundamental belief that land is given by the nature and the progress of the society which is reflected in the land value should be enjoyed together by the whole nation. However, in order to implement such a tax system, it's crucial for the land and the buildings to be assessed accurately, reliably. That's why my presentation will be focusing on how to value the land and the buildings in Taiwan. Looking back, we will find that between the 1950s and the 1970s, there were a number of legislations that were enacted at that time. Those legislations actually put out the framework of our tax system. And we had a number of features in our tax system that distinguish Taiwan from most of the countries. For example, the taxpayers in Taiwan are encouraged to self-report the value of the land to the government. In the early days of this system, imagine there was no computer, there was no internet, there was no transparent market. How could the government know the value of the land? So our system says the landowner should be the person who knows the value most. So even till now, in our laws, we encourage the tax owners, the taxpayers to report the value of the land, the tax base, to the government. And also from the very beginning, the land and the buildings are taxed separately at the different rates in Taiwan. Also, we have the progressive tax rate structure for both holding tax and for the transfer tax. Therefore, the progressive tax rates applied in both the land value tax, which is the annual tax, is a holding tax, and also applied to the land value increment tax, which is a form of the capital gain tax. And also, the country give a preferential tax rate to owner occupants to promote the owner occupation. So we give a special rate to the people who own and use their house. And finally, we have a idle land tax, which is rather rare worldwide. Idle land tax can be levied on land which is underutilized, and it could be levied by the local government if they deem that's necessary. So those features actually distinguish Taiwan from many other countries. However, even though the concept is not that difficult to understand, I do believe how it is practiced is little known to the international audience. In order to implement our tax, we actually created the land value section in every city and the county. Every city or county is divided into many land value sections. In Taipei alone, at this point of time, there are more than 4,000 land value sections. And the local government put the land with the similar characteristics into the same land valuation section. They are similar in terms of the location, in terms of the zoning, in terms of the public service, the access to the public service. So they are supposed to have the values similar. So that's one way of doing mass appraisal at a time when we didn't have a computer, we didn't have lots of modern equipment. Okay, so that's one of the land value station in Taipei. Actually, it's the Taipei 101 area. We like to show Taipei 101 to friends from overseas. And also, this is another land value section. It's actually in the western part of Taipei. It's a more early developed area. So you will easy to find that the parcel tends to be much smaller, even within one land value section. By so doing, we could assess the value
more frequently. So actually, we assess the land value every year. This is the map that's showing the value distribution of land in Taipei. So the government, through this kind of mechanism, can actually monitor the change of the land value to reflect the current, to bring the valuation up to date. That's one feature we have that is not often seen in other countries. Now I'm going to provide you a number of figures that reflect how we actually practice the tax system. This table shows the number of owners who actually report the value to the government. If you look at the figures over time, in the early days, actually, the percentage of people who report the value to the government was very high. In the 1960s, it was even as high as 98 and 99%. But since late 1980s, the percentage dropped significantly. And 2 years ago, the figure was actually 0.03%. One of the reasons is our law says if the landowners don't report the value to the government will use 80% of the assessed value as the taxable value. So automatically, that's the best deal you can do. So even though we look like we keep the system, but I would say actually it's not really functioning as we plan to be in the first place. And this table shows what the percentage of how many landowners whose land is taxed at a progressive rate for land value tax. There were about 8% of landowners whose land were taxed at a tax rate over 2.5%. It's not particularly high, and the progressive rate was introduced to kind of mitigate the concentration of land ownership. And another figure shows the percentage of land that's taxed at a progressive rate over this 30%. The previous table shows the figure for holding tax, for land value tax, and this figure shows the percentage for land value increment tax. It's a transfer tax. It's a tax when someone sells the land. And there's about 15% of the land that were levied at a progressive rate. Another tax is quite rare in other countries is idle land tax. Our law says if the land, if a piece of land is not used, it's vacant, or it is used but with the building valued less than 10% of the value of the land, that will be deemed as idle land. So the government, the local government, had the right to do a few things. First of all, the government will set a date and to ask the landowners to develop the land before that day. If the landowners did not develop the land, the government would first impose idle land tax. And the amount of idle land tax is equivalent to 2 to 5 times of the regular annual land value tax. The government actually otherwise could purchase the land. And the most severe threat from the government is to purchase the land. But in the past, the idle land was used only twice in Taipei. But it ended with the cancellation of the tax because at the end of the tax, it met the declined property price. So it was not actually used too many times. And also, even though we have a progressive tax rate, in Taiwan, a very recent statistic shows that under the top 5.5% of the house owners own 16% of the total housing stock. So we still have the problem of uneven distribution and the concentration of the houses. In reflection, I identify 5 major challenges and how Taiwan responds to those challenges. This kind of tax system demands lots of manpower, but our government came up with the idea of land valuation section that saved lots of time and the manpowers. And it used to be like the market was not that transparent, but the government in recent years collaborated with some primary real estate agent to get data from them. And also, since August 2012, the government passed a law that required the property seller to report the actual sale price to the government. So now the market became much more transparent. And the government also issued a number of assessment guidance for the assessors to follow. And the government set up an expert panel that invite professionals from outside the government, like professors or like real estate appraisers, to join the panel. And finally, now Taiwan has more and more very much well-organized citizen group. They keep a close eye on the valuation result. So that's how we respond to our challenge. And the final slide is the lessons we could offer to ourselves and to the rest of the world. I do believe we should continue make the best use of the market information and the modern technology that Taiwan always very proud of. Another challenge for us, and we have to very much careful about, is how the government can defend the assessment result in the court. That become a challenge. And we had to do a thorough examination to look at our land tax to see how effective they are as a policy tool. And in addition to those lessons, for the rest of the world, I would suggest that any country that want to use a tax system on land and property should have reliable registration system and a transparent market. And also, the last thing I think we can offer to other countries is to take land tax seriously as one of the policy tools that should be available if the market tend to have problems. That must be one of the effective tools we could use. That brings me to the conclusion of my presentation, and thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Professor Lin. Thank you. Moving on to paper 7, this is on the split rate property tax system. Welcoming our presenter, Professor Wu Wenjie. Professor Wu, thank you.
Good afternoon. My name is Jack Wu from National Zhengzhi University. I would like to share with you the split rate property tax systems implemented in Taiwan. It is not the only one in the world, but it does have some special features that are worthy to be mentioned. So the experience of Taiwan can provide lessons to the countries considering to implement such kind of systems. And this is my outline. I'm going to briefly talk about what the split rate property tax systems is, and then how it is practiced and reformed in Taiwan, and its special features, and also its performance on physical financing efficiency and equity, and its problems and challenges. Also, the lessons provided by the systems. And also, I'm going to give some recommendations for the future. And if we look, the split rate property tax system comprises of tax on value of land and tax on value of improvement. The goal of the systems includes the physical financing efficiency and equities. If we look at the efficiency, then the land supply is normally inelastic, so the tax rate can be set at a higher level. The improvement is movable, so it's relatively elastic, so the tax rate can be set at the lower levels. So this is based on the efficiency point of view. The challenges of implementations include the administrative challenges and assessment challenges. There are two taxes, so we need to have two administrative offices. And then there are two assessment values, so we also face the assessment challenges. Over 700 cities in 30 countries worldwide, including Pittsburgh in the United States, ever implemented such a assistance. Now come back to Taiwan. Although the land value tax was implemented in Nanjing, China, but if we talk about the split rate property tax systems, it was officially implemented in 1968 in Taiwan. The split rate system comprises of land value tax and the building tax. The land value tax was originally implemented for the purpose of capturing the speculative land value. So it wasn't really for the physical financing purpose. However, the building tax was later introduced for the purpose of physical financings. And right now, the land value tax is considered as a progressive tax system. But we do have a special rate for the owner-occupied residential purpose. So the tax rate is about 0.2%. But for the progressive tax systems, although we have about 6 tax brackets, and the tax rate is ranged from 1% to 5.5% right now. But according to the Professor Lin's data, in fact, most of cases are belonging to the lowest tax brackets. So they are basically paying for about 1%. But if you look at the building tax, it is flat tax rate systems. And the tax rate is centrally regulated, but locally determined. So the central government provides the range for the building tax rates, but then the local government determined the final rate. So for example, for the owner-occupied residential buildings, right now the tax rate is about 1.2%, although that is the lowest rate for the range. But if you look at the land value tax rate and the building tax rate in Taiwan, in fact, the land value tax rate is generally smaller than the building tax rate. So it actually violates the basic rationales for the efficiencies. So this comes to the special feature in Taiwan. So the tax rate for land value is generally smaller than the tax rate for building values. And so it has been a long-lasting debate in Taiwan between the land scholars and the public economists. We have a different point of view. And the land scholars want the land justice, while the public economists want efficiency. So basically, we just debated on these issues, and we disagree with each other, just like Keynes and classical schools. And so that is the first special features in Taiwan. The second feature is that both land value tax rate and building tax rates are centrally regulated. So they are basically uniform across the local jurisdictions. Local government can only influence the tax basis. As a result, the tax bases are normally under asset for the purpose of the local tax competitions. So you can see, like, for the assessment values in Taiwan are very low. Later, I can talk about the assessment ratios. And then the special feature 3, both land value tax and building tax are administered by 2 different government offices. Then the administration office is responsible for land value tax, whereas the local tax authority is responsible for building tax. As a result, the administration costs are quite high because we have 2 administration's office who are involved with this. The last feature is about the illegal aided structures in Taiwan. When you are in Taiwan, you will see, like, on each building on the top, there is an illegal aided structures, and it's quite common phenomenon. And in fact, in Taiwan, the government imposes a building tax on the value of illegally aided structures. And because we have implemented this kind of split rate assistance, so we can levy building tax, but not the land value tax on the value of illegally aided structures. And in fact, most of owners of illegal structures do not really know that they are paying taxes for illegal parts of the buildings. And so later I will show you how much Taipei City government actually collect the tax revenues from this part. So now I would like to look at the performance. For the physical financing, now the property tax revenue takes up less than 1% of the GDP in Taiwan. And then it takes up about 7% of the total tax revenue, or not the local tax revenue, the total tax revenues. And then the building tax revenues collected from illegal structures in Taipei were totally $3 million a year. So, but that is just based on those illegal structures caught by the authorities. But we still have a lot of illegal structures which are not caught by the city government. So in terms of efficiency, in fact, I don't find the existing study that empirically examines the link between split rate tax systems and the efficiency of land use. But according to the data, we know like now in Taiwan, we do have 1.8 million houses which are not occupied. So that's vacant houses. And we also have about 20 to 30% of land which are not constructed. So basically, that means the land use is not that efficient. And in terms of the equity, there is a wide differential in effective tax rates across the individual properties in Taiwan. Effective tax rates are the tax payment divided by the market value of the properties. And now the average effective tax rate in Taiwan is around 23 to 25%. And, oh no, not really 23, that's a 0.12%. That's a 0.12% effective tax rate. And then effective tax rates fall with incomes. The wealthy people are actually paying the lower effective tax rates. And then according to the capitalizations, we find the current tax rate is smaller than the optimum tax rate for both medium value and high value properties. But on the other hand, the current tax rate is larger than the optimum tax revenue for the low value properties in Taiwan. So here are the problems and challenges we face here. The first one is high administration cost. We do have the two offices which are involved with this. And then we have the larger assessment biases. The assessment biases is the difference between the assessment value and the market value. According to what I said, the assessment ratio is about 23 to 25%. So that means the assessment value only takes up about 25% of the market value. So that causes the low effective tax rates. It's what I said, the effective tax rate on average is only 0.12% in Taiwan. And right now, we have a so-called real estate transaction price data. Like when you are selling a house or buying a house, you have to report the real transactions price on the internet. So now the data is available. But however, we don't use that to be the tax base of the property tax systems. Mainly because now we have a split rate assistance, and the real estate transaction price is the price for the whole properties. So the lessons learned from Taiwan's experiences, I think a well-designed systems should concern more about the setting of the tax rates. Right now, the Taiwan's tax rates still have some kind of problems, and we really have to improve it. And then the assessment biases of the text bases are also quite serious problems for Taiwan. And then effectiveness of the administrations is also quite important. So my recommendation for Taiwan is to probably have the single administration's office and try to reduce the assessment biases by either using a more appropriate assessment techniques, and also can raise the tax rate for land value tax because it's quite low right now. It's only 0.2%. And to effectively utilize the real transaction price data in value assessment. The last one is for the recommendation for the rest of the world. Personally speaking, I don't really strongly advocate this kind of split rate systems. But if some cities would like to have this kind of split rate property tax systems, I recommend them to consider to adopt land value tax only. Just building tax value is tax-free, a variant of the split rate assistance. At least we still levy a higher tax rate on land, and also we can reduce the administration cost. And so this is my presentation. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Wu. Thank you very much. That was on split rate property tax system. Now, last paper, last but not least, immovable property tax reform. Please welcome Professor Yao Minghong. Professor Yao, thank you.
Dear Chair, Dr. Xu, and dear discussant, Dr. Bo, Dr. Cornell, and dear presenter, Dr. Lin and Dr. Wu, I'm Minghong Yao. It's my honor to present here today. Actually, I'm a little bit nervous because so many of my teachers are here today. Anyway, my presentation title is Income Tax Reform, Taxing the Income from Real Estate Transaction by Consolidating Housing and Land. My presentation outline, first, I will briefly introduce how to tax real estate transaction income before 2016 income tax reform. And then I will review the land value increment tax and its practice. And then I will introduce the 2016 income tax reform in Taiwan and its concern. Finally, I will give some recommendation for the future. Taiwan's land tax system is classified into land value tax, agricultural land tax, and land value increment tax. Land value tax is levied on the ownership of land, which tax base is the declared land value. Agricultural land tax, it is suspended since 1985, and my presentation will focus on the third one, land value increment tax. It's essentially an income tax on gain from land transaction. And before the income tax reform, the tax levy on the gain from real estate transaction is split into two parts, house and the land. For the part of house, the gain is included in individual income, subject to income tax. On the other hand, land value increment tax is levied on gain from land transaction. The liability of the land value increment tax is based on the total amount of land value increment and subject to a progressive tax rate structure. The government assess present value of land is used to calculate the total amount of land value increment rather than the actual realized transaction value. When land value increment tax was firstly levied in 1949 in Taiwan, the progressive tax structure is classified into four brackets based on increment multiple. beginning in 2005, the land value increment tax structure was reduced to 3 brackets of 20%, 30%, and 40% percentage, the tax rate. And this figure shows the trend of land value increment tax revenue and the ratio of the land value increment tax revenue to total tax revenue of the government. And the unweighted average is about 4.5%. And since the land value tax and land value increment tax are important revenues to local public finance, it might be interesting to compare both taxes. Figures 4 shows the trend of the land value increment tax revenue and land value tax revenue to GDP during the period 2002 and 2016. The ratio of the land value tax revenue to GDP is ranging from 0.4% to 0.5%. On the other hand, the ratio of tax value increment tax revenue to GDP is ranging from 0.4% to 0.7%, which is much more floated and cyclical. And figure 5, this figure shows the trend of the ratio of land value increment tax and the land value tax revenue to local government self-financing revenues over the period. The unweighted average for the land value increment tax is about 30%. And for the land value tax is about 24%. I calculate the elasticity coefficient of the land value increment tax revenue to GDP implies that 1% increase in GDP causes 1.2% increase in land value increment tax revenue, which is elastic. And I will talk about the practical issues of the land value increment tax. First, the land value increment tax liability is based on the government assets present value of land. It is a lag price based on land transactions during the past 1 year. So if the real estate prices increase dramatically, the government assets present value of land is unable to capture the actual income from land transactions. Moreover, the realized capital gain of any transactions of land within a given calendar year are escaped from the tax liability, which means there is a tax holiday. And the third one, the progressive tax rate structure results in the lock-in effect. Usually, when you hold a land for a long time, you will have more land value increment and subject to a higher tax rate, which means you might not want to sell it. And this is called the lock-in effect and reduce the mobility of the land rights. And finally, the land value increment tax is distributed progressively related to family income, but it is far away from being a horizontally equitable tax. Okay, so now I will talk about since the defect land value increment tax is thought as an unfair tax. Some scholars discuss the existence of the land value increment tax. First, the gain from real estate transaction is split into two parts. house, and land, subject to different tax treatment. Actually, both of them are the same in nature. So a more comprehensive capital gain tax should be implemented for equally treating different types of capital gains. And the second one, the progressive tax structure penalizes long-term land holding and encourage short-term land speculation. And the third one, the government assets present value of land is far below the market level. And some supportive opinions of the land value increment tax are as follows. First, the tax administration and collection cost is relatively low. And the second one, even if the land value increment is incorporated in a individual income or a comprehensive capital gain, the lock-in effect still exists. The third one, the land value increment tax is very important to local public finance. And the third one, and maybe the most important one, is the legislative issue. Land value increment tax is stipulated in Constitution. Due to its Constitution status, it is very difficult to abolish land value increment tax under Taiwan's political environment. Considering both the pros and the cons of land value increment tax, especially the legislative issue, Taiwan government decided to amend the Income Tax Act to capture the actual realized gains. The Income Tax Act was amended in June 2015 to tax the actual gain from real estate transactions based on combination of house and land. The new real property income tax regime has taken effect since 2016. The land value increment tax remains unchanged by the implementation of the income tax reform. The tax base of the real estate transaction income tax is the sales price of the real estate, reduced by purchase cost and the expense, and the total increment in government assets present value of land to avoid a double taxation. How about the tax rate? There is a punitive tax rate of 45% for a sale of a land with less than 1 year holding, and 35% for more than 1 year but less than 2 years holding. For more than 2 years but less than 10 years holding, the tax rate is 20%. To eliminate the lock-in effect, the tax rate is 15% for more than 10 years holding. Of course, there are tax relief for a sale of owner-occupied residential land. The 2016 income tax reform succeeded in capturing the actual capital gain from the real estate transaction. However, there are still some issues need to be addressed. First, the actual capital gain are again split into two parts: the land value increment tax and the transaction income tax. And there are this is the inequity treatment problem. The land value increment tax is a progressive tax rate. For the transaction income tax, it's a proportional tax rate. So there is an inequity treatment of these two tax bases. And second one, there is a double incentive for holding the agricultural lands. There is an exemption for property transaction income from agricultural lands, as in the land value increment tax case. Meanwhile, there is also a tax relief when holding agricultural lands. Therefore, the income tax regime creates a double incentive for holding agricultural lands. And finally, since the tax base is split into land value increment tax and real estate transaction income tax, and whose tax administration are different. For the land value increment tax, the tax authority is the local government. For the real estate transaction income tax, the tax authority is the central government, which will which results in the tax competition between the central and the local tax authorities. Finally, I have some recommendation for the future. First, the provision of double incentive for agricultural lands should be revised or removed. And the second one, a more comprehensive capital gain tax should be used to replace this long practice land value increment tax. And since this land value increment tax abolished in the long run, a well-designed intergovernmental fiscal transfer mechanism should be implemented. Thank you. Thank you for my presentation.
Thank you, sir. Thank you, Professor Yao. Professor Yao, would you like to just be seated on stage to join us for the panel discussion? Welcoming our moderator, our chair, our Professor Steve Choi, please. With our applause, thank you. And welcoming our presenter, Professor Lin Ziqing, Professor Lin, and Professor Wu Wenjie, Professor Wu, Professor Yao, still on stage. And of course, our members of the board of ICL-PST, Professor Roy Bell and Professor Gary Cornea, our discussants. Please, thank you, please join us. Your input is very valuable to us. Thank you, sir. Yeah, we do the group photo for the panel. Professor Choi, we do the group photo, yes. Yeah, our chair in the center, okay. One more, okay. Thank you very much. Please be seated. And Professor Choi, the floor is yours.
Okay. Good afternoon. Okay, this is the final panel of discussions this afternoon. And after that, we will have a concluding section. And after that, we are going to have a big dinner. Very good. I have to say thank you to ICL-PST first for organizing this meaningful event, and also thank you again to the Lincoln Institute. Thank you very much. Gary, it has been a long time since I last see you. It didn't change a lot, okay? And Roy, I believe it's pretty much like 3 years since our last met. You did change. You get younger, okay? Also, thank you very much, okay, for Professor Lin, Professor Wu, and Professor Yao for a wonderful presentation. Well, we have something, we have an interesting question mentioned this afternoon. I believe the event is presented by Jack, Professor Wu. He talked about a dispute between different view of points about property taxation, especially related to land taxation in Taiwan. Well, we have two different schools. One is what we call the land economics or land administration school. Another one is the public finance school. Okay, I used to work at National Chengchi University as the public finance professor. So maybe when I'm chairing this section, I would be a little bit biased to the public finance point of view. However, looking at my background, I graduated from the Department of Journalism, okay, from National Tsinghua University. That means I will be as neutral as I was trained during my college education. Okay, I have to mention that Professor Yao and Professor Wu, they are both my students. So I will require much more than Professor Lin as my colleague on this presentation. But this afternoon, the last section is related to property taxation in Taiwan. So as we talk about property taxation in Taiwan, actually we pay all our focus on the property tax, especially with the real property. So we tax house, sometimes we call it house and buildings tax, and then we also tax the ownership of land, and that is what you call the land value tax, a very, very progressive system. And then the tax rate will go from 1% to 5.5%. Well, if with a preferential treatment for owner-occupied housing land, that is 0.2. However, as related to the structure of the land value tax is concerned, it is really, really progressive. Yet, I believe that was 10 years ago, when we are celebrating our 40th anniversary, I did present a paper. The paper is on land value increment tax in Taiwan. And the final conclusion I come up with improving the land value increment tax in Taiwan is not asking for a constitutional amendment. We know we cannot do it. However, we are asking for a better and more efficient and more fair evaluation system of the land value increment tax. So that is the problem of the land value increment tax and also the land value tax are completely related to unviewable, it's unbelievably not assess government system value for tax purpose. So I believe that Professor Lin, he not only delivered 2 lectures on the regular section 138, we just conclude for this year, but also he presented a paper on that, so it will be a very interesting one. And as related to the income tax reform, the income tax reform, Professor Yao talked about, I just want to give you some information. Beginning 2014, we have a series of income tax reform in Taiwan. In 2014, we have a sound finance system such that our government turned our full imputation income tax system into half imputation, partial imputation system. In year 2016, 2015, we have our focus on how we can tax capital gains, especially capital gains from real property transaction. And we come up with the result, and the result was reported and presented by Professor Yao this afternoon. So, we do have a very interesting ownership property tax system, such that we split our property into 2 parts. One is on land, another one is on building, and our government believe that they were careful enough to distinguish the value of the land to pay a tax and distinguish the value of the building to pay another tax. Well, that is really, really interesting, and I believe that it will be discussed really, really detailed by Professor Jack already. So this is what we have this afternoon, and I am going to call upon Roy or Gary, depend on which one would like to go and give the comment first. Okay.
Go ahead.
Roy, you want to do it first?
Okay. Can you hear me? Okay, I have to share my time with Gary. So he'll be mad at me if I talk too long, and so I'll watch this. Good work to the 3 authors. You know, if you're an academic, you like to stay within your comfort zone, but these 3 guys had to work on the economics, the planning, the tax administration, and the politics in order to get it right. And I think you did a terrific job of carrying us a long way forward in understanding how this system works and giving us a basis for beginning to discuss property tax reform in Taiwan. I think that's really good. The property tax here, just to make sure we have it,
right is the land value tax, the tax on buildings, the land value increment tax, and the new capital gains tax in the income tax regime. And the lessons from what they have worked on are important for other countries in the world, and particularly in the region. And I'm going to tell you about that in a minute. But actually, Taiwan does some things that are fairly unique. And I think that countries that are in the midst of property tax reform, for example, Philippines, Indonesia, Vietnam is away but moving toward property tax. The questions in India and Pakistan are important on the property tax. And in a lot of countries, what you talked about today has lessons, good ones and bad ones for other countries. I know I'm going to run out of time, so let me just tell you my punchline about what I conclude from all of this. You know, there's an old saying about you ought to fix what's broken and you ought not to try to fix what's not broken. I don't think Sun Yat-sen's theory about how you ought to tax property is broken at all. If anything, it's more relevant now with the rate of urbanization around the world than it ever was. That's not the thing we need to fix. The thing we need to fix is the tax administration, because that's what's broken, and the political interference with the structure of the system, because that's what's broken. So I think that's the basic story that I would like to tell. I'm going to just make some disjointed comments about 5 issues. And so if you start to get a little tired, just count them. So I'm only going to talk about 5 things quickly. First of all, I was impressed with how the political system interfered with the structure and administration of the tax in Taiwan. If I understand it right, you gave good examples of how that happened. And a lot of it was justified by the fact that the burden was high and that there needed to be relief on the property tax. But in fact, the burden is not high in Taiwan. Actually, the burden is quite low in Taiwan. You tax, in your papers, you report, if I have it right, about 1.4% of GDP as the average rate of property taxation in Taiwan. The average for industrial countries is 2.2% of GDP. Countries like the United States and Canada are well over 3%. The average for low-income countries, developing countries, is about 0.6% of GDP. So if you consider the income of Taiwan, Taiwan is a relatively low-taxing country. So what is the justification for providing all of this relief? If this were going on in my country, I would say it was pure politics, and I bet you a nickel that's what it is here. By the way, you may be interested that in China there is no property tax, an annual property tax. They tax some instruments related to real property. They tax deeds and certain kinds of land use changes, and it's about the same level that you tax property. But there is no annual property tax in China. Government is promising one this year, but we'll see it when it comes. So, first point, Taiwan's a relatively low taxing country, and when you tax as low as Taiwan taxes, you don't get these impacts that you've been talking about on land use. So until you raise the level of taxation in the country, you won't get what you want out of the property tax. Second point, you know, what do let's talk about developing countries, because until now, your administrative system looks more like a developing country than an advanced country. Your structure looks more like an advanced country than a developing country. But let's talk about developing countries and what they do. They tax land and structures. Most countries tax land and structures jointly, as you're proposing that Taiwan should move toward. And they tax property transfers at the time of exchange. In the assessment of the land and property under the annual property tax, they basically use very poor data to make the assessment, and they generally assess the land and the building separately. But under the property transfer tax, it's not a capital gains tax at all. In fact, in very few countries in the world is it a capital gains tax. It's basically a sales tax. So if I sell you a property for $1 million NT, the tax is on the total value of the sales. And how is it assessed? Owner declarations. Now, we all know how honest owners are going to be in that world, right? Especially when the rate is 5%. And so what happens is owners declare, they underdeclare dramatically. There's no checks on it. The revenue comes in. Next year, the government raises the rate higher, and you get a more inefficient outcome. So the property transfer tax is a disaster in most low-income countries around the world. Now, here comes Taiwan. Taiwan taxes land and buildings separately, and they use kind of a deduction method to get back to a value. You have a reproduction cost approach to valuing buildings, and you have a comparative sales approach to taxing land. The problem is that you have really bad data heretofore, previously, in the taxation of the land. But you actually have a capital gains tax in the system, and that's rare. And so there's really something to learn from the success that we can see on this capital gains tax in your country. Third, when I was a young man working at the International Monetary Fund, one of the seniors took me aside early and patted me on the head and told me that, you know, tax administration is tax policy. And here all this time, you know, you wanted to work on tax policy, but really how you administer the tax is really the kind of tax that you have. It doesn't matter what the law says. It matters how it's actually implemented. Well, property tax is the hardest of all. You've got all 4 steps that have to work together. You've got to get the property registered. You've got to get the record keeping in place. You've got to value the property, and you've got to collect it. And if all 4 of those things aren't marching along in step somehow, you don't get the revenue at the end of the day. So in your case, there's the big problem. You have an assessment ratio, depending on which of the papers you read, that looks to be somewhere between 10 and 20%. That's pretty poor. That sounds like a developing country. It doesn't sound like an industrial country. The data are badly flawed, at least it was before. The new data, the reported data after 2014, something like that, should be better data. But my question to you would be, how in the world do we know it's better data? Is there any? There should be an independent appraisal so that properties can be compared objectively, an independent appraisal with the new data that are coming in. And I don't know if that exists in Taiwan or not, but that should be in place, and it tells you 2 things. It tells you whether the average assessment, what the average assessment ought to be, but it also tells you about the dispersion in terms of dispersion across properties. And I think that's terribly important. So the land value increment tax, the politicians, I think, have introduced all of these shortcuts, and the tax administrators have introduced shortcuts. And so it's not clear what we're taxing. Sun Yat-sen said we ought to be taxing the land at a higher rate. than the buildings, and he was exactly right about that. But it seems like somehow that doesn't happen in Taiwan. So there's the flaw to sort out. Fourth, undesirable effects of the property tax. I thought there was some clever analysis done by our colleagues here, one suggesting the property tax might be regressive. But the more I looked at the papers, the more I felt that that had to do with assessment bias than with the property tax itself. And then there was the issue of positive capitalization that was in a couple of the papers. But again, I think that basically is because there's a lot more to that analysis. So the basic flaws in the system, to me, weren't very convincing. I kept coming back to bad administration and coming down on the side of the structure in Taiwan being quite good. So, as an outsider who is not encumbered with a lot of knowledge about Taiwan, here's where I would come down on reforms. First, I wouldn't give up on separating land and buildings. I think only if the administration forced you into it, the administrative considerations forced you into it. If you have to do the valuation of buildings anyway, then separating land and buildings, to me, makes a lot of sense in terms of efficiency, but only if you levy the property tax at a much higher rate than is being levied now. Second, I would drop the progressive rates. Goodness gracious, it doesn't sound like you get very much out of it from your data. And if you assess the property right, then you have less need for it. Third, I would think about an independent validation of the sales data with separate appraisals so that you could do a check against the property tax values. Fourth, I don't know. I kind of like the land value increment tax, and I kind of wonder with the new data if one couldn't actually make that work the way it ought to work. You know, I think you ought to simplify the property tax. As I read the papers, and I read the papers and I thought, this is about as complicated as any property tax I ever read. And I think these guys, I'll bet you if they sat down and had a cup of coffee with you, they'd tell you they didn't really know what they were getting into when they were trying to describe this thing. That it's really, really complicated. Well, if it's complicated for guys as smart as this, what do you think about the average person out there who pays the tax? They don't have a clue what in the world kind of tax they're paying. So there's a lot to be said about simplification. So every country ought to be able to call on guys like you to get us started in thinking about reform. Good job.
You know, okay, it's always terrible to be on the end for a lot, even if it's before lunch or before the end of the meeting, because you're in the way of a meal. Now I think I'm in the way of a meal, possibly a cocktail or two. But there's also going to be a graduation later tonight. And there's a number of people in the room who are going to be catching airplanes tomorrow. So I feel like I have, if I go too long, I might not make it out of here alive. So, but unfortunately, Roy, I only have 138 points to make. So your 5 will pale in comparison. There's a fundamental assumption in all of these papers, and I think in this room, and that is that a land value tax is good economics. I think we all would agree with that. But I think we also would agree that it's bad politics. It is something that creates all kinds of political challenges and all kinds of administrative policies. And at the end of the day, those political issues, as Roy has pointed out, seem to take precedent. So we find that administration in a country that is very proud of its land value taxation. The administration is probably underfunded and understaffed, and that undoubtedly creates some of the challenges around valuation and uniformity and equity that I think we find running through these papers. Good economic policy loses out to politics. And that's why the papers and this country are so important. What these kinds of papers need to do is help us understand the advantages of a land value tax. And that's one thing I would urge the papers to think about, helping people understand in a bit more detail the advantages of the tax system that they're talking about, the advantages of a land value tax, the economic advantages, and not just for people that come to conferences like this. I don't think that's as critical, but these kinds of papers always ought to have some examples, counterexamples of what this kind of tax does to benefit the local government and the national government. Because we make a mistake when we assume that policymakers, when they read these kinds of papers or think about these kinds of issues, understand the economics. They don't. And in every tax reform I've ever been involved in, any attempt to improve a tax system, at the end of the day, the policymakers look at the losers and the winners, and the losers often carry the day if they don't understand the bigger implications. So that's one of the things I would think that you'd think about in the papers is doing a good job. And I will give you an example. Roy spent time in Jamaica a few years ago looking at their tax system where they had a land value tax. And not because of Roy, I hope, but at the end of the day, they walked away from essentially the land value tax. Pittsburgh had a great system, and which we use all the time as an example, but in fact, Pittsburgh has walked away from the land value tax, again, for administrative and political reasons. And so good examples, or why it makes sense, should be, I think, a critical part of what you're trying to do. And I don't know if the data are out there, but it would be interesting if we could show that this tax system has accomplished some of the things we want to see accomplished in more intensive capital use, better land use, and again, I have no idea if the data are out there to really get where we want to be. I like to tell my students when we start talking about tax policy to talk about two things, to talk about the base and the rate. Is the problem of inadequate revenue, is it a base problem or a rate problem? An example would be the sales tax in the United States. If you look around the 50 states that impose a sales tax, retail sales tax, or the 40 plus states that do, the sales tax is being challenged all the time. It's being challenged because the base is fundamentally changing. Services in the United States that aren't taxed are increasing, and goods that are taxed are decreasing in our economy. At the same time, we have internet taxation that is continually making it more difficult to collect the sales tax. So if you think about the sales tax, it's not a rate problem, it's a base problem. And I think with this kind of tax system, it clearly becomes a base problem. And the base problem always will be, how do you value the property? How do you value the land? Because the land sales, an independent piece of land that's sold, it's very thin. Everywhere you look, there's some kind of improvement on the land. So when you look at the sales, which will include the improvement and the land, you have a challenge. And the challenge is, how do you make that separation? And I would like to tell you that We've got that all figured out in tax policy and tax administration. We don't. We don't do a very good job of trying to separate the value of the building from the value of the land, and it complicates, whatever you do, it complicates what you're trying to do. So let me make another suggestion that I think would be helpful for the papers. When you do a residual method, where you try to figure out what the value of the land is, when you take away the value of the building, you end up looking at the cost approach to valuation. So you try to approach what it would cost to rebuild a particular piece of a building on the property. That is always a challenge, but I believe, and maybe it's there, it just is not reported, I think it's important that people who read these papers understand where you come up with your cost approach values. You know, a sidebar table that would suggest this is how we value a particular type of property, particular type of building per square foot. And then you do something that is really interesting, and that is you take out depreciation. Now, typically we call that an obsolescence adjustment. It would be interesting to know what kind of scaling you use or what kind of matrix you use to pull that out. Why? Because countries that think about doing this need to understand how you make that adjustment for diminished quality. And then you make some adjustments for the location around roads and other things. That would also be important. Again, not a major part of the paper, but people who read this, the immediate response is, well, we can't make a separation between land and building. But if you could give us some hint, some sense, an example or two of how you make adjustments for location on the value of the capital improvements, I think what you do would be helpful for us to see how you do that. You use several committees to sort of adjudicate differences between values. And I would like to know how that works. You probably would like to know how that works. It becomes a political process, and that's unfortunate. I understand why you do it for those political reasons, but it would be helpful if we had a little more information about how those valuation committees, both for buildings and land, operate. Now, I've probably added about 50 pages to your paper, and I apologize that. It's not that I don't like trees, but I think those are things that would be helpful as you think about your paper. And I couldn't agree more with Roy about the importance of validating the self-reported values that we find. If you have those kind of disclosure laws and you can validate those disclosure laws, you will fundamentally improve the tax administration and the outcomes of tax policy. And that would be a strong suggestion to me. A final thing. In the 60s, there was a lawsuit in the city of Boston that included people like Dan Holland and Ollie Oldman, and names that you may or may not be familiar with. They played for the Boston Red Sox, if that helps any. But the lawsuit was over the inequities in the property tax systems in the city of Boston. An article in the National Tax Association that had very simple numbers in it. But the Boston Globe picked up on this story and wrote issue after, I don't know, 3 or 4 big issues on the inequities in the property tax system in the city of Boston. The result was a reappraisal throughout Massachusetts. But I think it had implications for the entire United States. Academics suddenly got interested in reporting inequities in the property tax system. So one of the things I think your papers could do is spend a little more time and identify some of the sales ratio problems you've identified, and also look at the dispersion that results from the perhaps inadequate administration. And I believe that kind of information encourages the press and the public to become more engaged in the property tax. And I think more interested in getting the right answer. And so I would urge you, you have powerful weapons there, and I think you ought to consider using it. The administration costs you talk about, and it might be difficult to figure out exactly what it is. I would like to understand exactly how high or how low it really is. It may be that it's not as expensive as you think it is, and it may be, if you do the study and can report it, you'll realize we need to spend more on this. I suspect that's what you're going to have, that we're not putting enough money into it. We have two groups valuing property in the land and the building. I'm sure you don't realize this, but Harris County, Texas, Houston used to have two systems. The property was appraised by the local assessor for tax purposes for the city and counties, and the property was appraised by the school districts for valuation for the schools. And guess what? It was a mess because they never were the same, and suddenly there were fights. Well, if they say it's this and they say it's that, now your problem is probably not as complex as that, but it does, if you can think about it, moving in the direction of a more uniform one system. And I'm saying something that you're going, well, duh. Of course that's what we should be doing. So in conclusion, interesting papers. I want this to be right. I want you to point out the advantages and the flaws, because I believe the economics around this kind of taxation is absolutely spot on, and we need to find ways to learn from some challenges you have had so that other countries, when they think about this, can say, yeah, it's hard to do, but we can make the right decisions to make it right. We can learn from challenges. We can learn from mistakes, and I think Taiwan can do that probably better than any other country in the world. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Gary. And well, thank you for the comment and the recommendation, and also for asking more and more from the papers, Gary. Okay. What I'm going to do, I'm going to see if there will be any questions or comments or opinions from the floor before I will ask our three presenters to summarize what they are doing, and after listening to the comments, what will be the instant response. Okay. Jim, are you going to give another question? And Professor Roach? Yeah. Okay, go ahead, Jim. I'll give you this one. Okay, not a long one.
No, not a long one. Well, wait, I'm an academic. I only talk for 1 hour, hour and a half, or 3 hours. No, just a quick comment here, because I was thinking when in FAO we would propose land tax as a way of having a policy tool, etc. Everybody would run. That's because we didn't have a good system of explaining why property taxes. So as Gary pointed out, I think is a very good thing that what do property taxes do? How do you see the way they're used? And then how do you make the public involved in determining why they would want to pay any kind of property tax? And when we have the history of paying taxes, we don't have the history of why I would want to pay taxes. And I think we need to bring this aspect in if we're going to have good tax policy spreading to other countries which can benefit from the experience that we're talking about here.
Okay, thank you, Jim. Yeah. Okay. I was thinking that George is going to ask a question. Yes, I know. Trying to explain to the general public why they have to pay tax is difficult. Or explain this to the students is okay. We have to pay tax to finance the spending of the government, such that we are not going to place the tax on your income only, but we also pay the tax on consumption And also, well, if you're wealthy enough, you own property, then we are going to impose a tax on the ownership of property. So, and also we mentioned something about fiscal federalism, such that the central government do something, the local government do something, such that the most reliable and equitable and efficient revenue for the local government would be the property tax, especially on real property. I do believe that we do a very good explanation to our student, to our participant. However, to our general public, that will be completely different story. I know we understand. However, to ask the tax administration to explain why they have to tax will not be so easy. They will be really, really efficient to collect the tax. Okay, however, explain why they have to collect the tax. They just do not know. I know that's one thing we have to understand. Okay, any further question? Any more question from the audience? If not, I will give the time to our three presenter and see what will be the instant response and or further explanation or clarification. So we'll go with my student first. No. I will go by the order of presentation. Okay, 子谦你先来。
Thank you to give me the opportunity to illustrate a little bit more. And actually, Professor Wu talked about we had two camps in Taiwan on the issue of property tax, and we don't agree with each other. And one group of people is my group of people, the land economist, land administrator. Another group will be the economist. But I have to confess that I am not a conventional land economist, and I don't think we still disagree with each other. We actually agree with each other on many things, but we have arguments about some little details. In my position, I spend more time on the tax base. And I was actually sitting in one of the committees. I was sitting in the valuation committee for the Taipei City for about 2 years. The committee, how the committee is functioning is every year the committee will gather at least once or twice to look at the valuation results submitted by the government officials. But in reality, we were not able to look into the details of every assessment for every parcel. So we rely on the evidence they produce. So they tend to tell us that what is the average rise of the land value in this district and in another district, and do you have anything that you don't, is there anything you don't agree with or you want to ask some questions? So normally, we only have 2 meetings for the valuation for the whole Taipei City. So I personally, I do suggest them to produce something that we can examine on, rather than something that we cannot disagree with. I believe they are working on that. But another 2 issues I want to raise is firstly, there have been increasing number of valuation disputes in the court at the moment because the government actually raised the tax base. To me, it's a good thing because people now feel the burden of the tax, so they care very much about how their property is valued. And those lawsuits normally come from the 5-star hotels because they pay a lot. That's very important, like Taipei 101 for the housing tax. Annually, Taipei 101 pay 200 million NT, over 200 million NT annually to the Taipei City government. So my suggestion is that the government have to produce something they can defend, and that will help we to look closer to the property assessment. And talking about the data, the quality of the data, the government introduced of the system that require the property seller to report the actual transaction price since August 2012. The law says the government will look into the accuracy of the data, and there will be penalty if someone did not report the price truthfully. I'm also curious about how they do it, but I only know they actually examine the data. And when they put the data online, they took out those data they believe they are not actually reported truthfully, in order not to misguide the people who are reading the data. But I don't know how exactly do they actually run some test to see if they are truthfully reported. I don't know, but by law they should. And also, Professor Wu mentioned those data was not used in the transaction, the capital gain tax. If I recall correctly, when the government wanted to introduce that mandatory reporting system, one condition is the government should not use the data to tax people. But personally, I think one day, and you will come very soon, the data will be used. And I think that would be an improvement for our system. I'm not very much, I'm not totally optimistic about the future improvement, but I'm not pessimistic either. So I think we have room to improve, and we will improve.
Okay, thanks for the comments. I totally agree with the good economics but bad politics. You know, the design of the systems may follow a very good economics, but sometimes it fails because of the politics. And so I think we need to kind of focus on the economics advantages of like land value tax, and then make it clear, like why it's good or it's bad, and then maybe that will provide the good lessons to those countries which would like to consider to implement land value tax.
Thank you for comments. For my part, I will, since the real estate transaction income tax has implemented for about 2 years, since 2016, and now there's a dual system. When you own a building before 2014, subject to the old tax system, that is the land increment tax, and the gain from house is included in your income tax. But since 2016, now there's a new real estate transaction income tax. So if we can have more and more data, we can look at what happened. It's the tax system capture the actual realized capital gain, and maybe we can make future recommendation. Yeah.
Good job.
Thank you very much. Okay. The last section actually we cover related to the property tax system in Taiwan. However, in the free presentation by my colleague and my previous students, we all understand that we do not only talk about property tax on land value tax and house tax. We also talk about something on a special capital gains on real estate transaction in Taiwan. Well, in theory, we treat this one as an income tax. And the one interesting thing is in Taiwan's structure, the land value tax, land value income tax, special income tax, and house tax, they are all local government's revenue. And the income tax system itself is the central government's revenue. So instead of overhauling the whole system, the central government in 2016, that was in 2015, they tried to reform the income tax system such that to tax the capital gains from real property transactions by the central government in the right rate. However, well, according to our constitution, it is quite impossible to have a constitutional amendment to erase the land value income tax from our constitution. So to keep this land value income tax in our tax map and let the local government to collect, it's possible, the land value income tax they used to collect, then we have to reform our income tax system to take the land value income tax liability as a tax credit against the central government's income tax. Well, I was in the committee. Actually, any bad thing that has accumulated by the Minister of Finance, I was in the committee. Okay, so our central government finally, they decide to deduct the tax base. That is the unreliable or unreal capital gains of our land value income tax from the income tax base instead of taking the land value income tax a tax credit. So that system began in 2016. So we are still in 2018. We do not know the result of it yet. However, in making this change, I believe that as far as the central government is concerned, we will do a better job in collecting capital gains tax from real estate transactions. So that is our mind. So we will take another 3 or 4 years and see what is the result of this reform, whether it is a reform getting better or actual deterioration. So the central government, the Minister of Finance, has asked me to wait for another 2 or 3 years that they will commission a project to do an evaluation on that. And that is pretty much okay. Thank you very much, Gary, and thank you very much, Roy, for your very good discussion. And also, thank you very much to Professor Lin, Professor Wu, and also to Professor Yao. And of course, I have to say thank you again to the Lincoln Institute and also to the ICLPST and my good friend Jim. Thank you very much for your helpful question. Thank you for the audience for the attendance.
Thank you to our Professor Tsui. Thank you to our moderator, our presenters, and our discussants. Thank you very much. And for the closing, I have to ask Professor Lin Ziqing to please stay for the research summary, right? Okay, thank you so much. Again, Professor Lin.
Am I after too? Yeah. Or after?
I was told I have 5 minutes, but I can have more. Okay. First of all, on behalf of the 9 professors who write 8 papers and 1 acting as the advisor, we have been working since last September. And first of all, I would like to, on behalf of the whole team, to express our gratitude to Lincoln Institute and ICOPST in supporting the teamwork. When I was approached to write a number of papers about what happened over the last half century in Taiwan regarding the land taxation and the land policy, to be honest, I was terrified, even though that's an interesting issue to me, and that's what I learned since I was 18 years old. And that was kind of my dream to see something to be documented about Taiwan. But I know it's a tough job to, I wouldn't call it lead a team, to coordinate a number of professors. Professor is kind of person who won't be controlled in any way. You can't tell them what to do and when to submit their chapters. And I'm not the senior one. I'm kind of in the middle. So I decided that I will find a team that is relatively young, who might listen to me to a certain extent. It took me quite some time to actually find a team of 8 professors. So I also want to take this opportunity to thank my colleagues who were willing to work with me for several months. We actually had a meeting more than 6 times. All of the meeting took place in the evening, from 6:30 to 9:30, even to 10 o'clock. And I told them it's a contract signed, so we had to stick to the contract. Otherwise, there's penalty, but I didn't tell them what penalty is. But there's no penalty. But we managed to submit the results in time. So I would like to thank everyone who involved in the project. And also, about the research, I'm not going to the details of each paper, but I do think there are 2 things in Taiwan that just recently happened that deserve our attention. The first thing is the August 2012, the government started requesting the property seller to report the actual transaction price. I think that's something significant in our policy making. It affects not only the assessment for the tax base, also it affects the market transparency. Because of that, the rating of market transparency for the real estate in Taiwan actually rise significantly in some international reports. And that gives the government a chance to actually implement the tax policy we promised years ago. Because the market transparency, I do believe in the near future, we should be able to make some improvements that we couldn't have done in the past. And the second thing that's significant is the National Spatial Planning Act that passed in 2 years ago. That actually kind of restructured the land use nationwide. That give another opportunity for Taiwan to think about our land use. That's another opportunity we had to grasp. And there are two things that led to what we've seen in Taiwan about the land problem we have. The first thing is the deregulation of agricultural land. As the paper mentioned before year 2000, not everyone could purchase a piece of land. But after year 2000, I can buy a piece of farmland, and that is something affect the land use in Taiwan. Another thing that affects Taiwan is the loose enforcement of law. The government never said we allow the factory on the farmland. They never said that. The government never said without permission everyone can build some extra space on top of the buildings. The government never said that. So if we look at Taiwan, even as an industrialized country, in some respect, we look like developing countries. And the people come to Taiwan ask me why almost every building would have a little small on top illegal extension. We have illegal structure from the city to the farmland. It's definitely not right. It's nothing to do with the theory, nothing to do with the 商业线. It's something to do with the enforcement of our law. I do believe there are two problems the mistake we made in the past, and I really hope that we can make it right. Lastly, I do hope you enjoy the 8 papers, and no matter you find the achievement or the problem we have in Taiwan, I do hope you can take something positive from our presentation and make a better policy for your country. And once again, thank you very much, and enjoy staying in Taiwan. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Professor Lin. Thank you. Wonderful 8 papers, wonderful research summary. Thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, and now for the closing remarks, please join me in welcoming Dr. George McCarthy, our President and CEO of Lincoln Institute of Land Policy. Thank you to Lincoln Institute of Land Policy for sponsoring our event, our forum, and our research papers. Thank you.
Well, thank you all, and it's been a long day, but it's been a fruitful day. And you know, one of the things I take away from the day is that if we think about land policy in Taiwan over the last 50 years, I think it's like a study in sequential problem solving, where you kind of understand the problem in front of you, you figure out a solution, and then it creates its own other issue. You figure out the solution to that. You figure out a solution to something else that comes at you from another side. But the thing about Taiwan is that the land policy started built on a very sound foundation of principle, and you have to love that. And that's the thing that attracted the Lincoln Institute in the first place, because Taiwan was built on a principle that said we can use land policy to promote social equity. We can use land policy to get to the kinds of outcomes that we know we can get to where other places haven't. We can combat poverty. We can combat inequality in our systems by getting land policy right. And so we found that fascinating enough that we helped to found the center. So one of the constants we learned across all the panels and all the papers was, of course, what we just heard from Chu Chin, which is that there's a big distance between the conception of the policy and the implementation of the policy. And one of the things we learned is that the implementation very often falls short of the aspirations we have for policies. You know, in the case of the agricultural land reform panels, we learned that everybody's building big mansions on agricultural land and not getting paid, not paying any tax on them. And now people are putting illegal industries on agricultural land and not paying any tax on that. And what does it tell us? Well, it tells us, like everything else, that any policy framework you create, people can circumvent because people find ways to game the system. They can get around the system, and we just need to find ways to do a better job of enforcing it. On urban land reforms, we also learned that, you know, that land readjustment got co-opted by developers, right? When these, you know, association-led land readjustments, developers are coming in and kind of using it as a tool to kind of actually displace lots of other landowners to the extent that they're now taking to the streets. And of course, on the taxation panel, we learned that there were the huge valuation problems, poor administration problems, and the aspiration of taxing land at a higher rate than buildings was never actually achieved because of defects in the administration of the taxes. So, you know, we learned all that, but in the end, what does that tell us? Well, it just tells us that we're imperfect. Land policy is imperfect. And what it also tells us is that as a land policy studies center, you're doing your job. That's what you do. People create land policies, you study them, and you remind them that you set out, you had an aspiration to achieve this, you didn't quite get there, let's work together to make it better. And one of the things that you have to appreciate over the last 50 years in Taiwan, as imperfect as the land policy was, that lots of good things happened. You guys grew faster than almost every economy in the globe for 20 years. You urbanized without creating slums. You were able to protect agricultural land, and you know, you still are able to find ways to feed yourselves. So it's not a bad story. It's not a bad story that things aren't quite working as well as we hoped they would work. And certainly one of the things that we hoped when we started this session and we asked for this research was, could we find a way to tell the story of land policy in Taiwan to learn the lessons that could help to inform other places that haven't been able to get anything close to the achievements that Taiwan has gotten over the last 50 years. And I think there's a lot here in these papers, and there's a lot here that we can do to help spread that around the world. But one of the things that struck me at the end of the session that we did on the urban land, when Jim started asking all the depressing questions about, well, now with the aging society, look at the aging building stock, look at the aging infrastructure, look at the unassailable challenges we have going forward for the next 50 years. And you're right, I mean, they look really big. And one of the things about economists is they can always add up a problem to make it look really big and unassailable. But then I thought, if we rewind the clock to the 1960s, and we think about, the 6 million people in Taiwan that welcomed another 2 million evacuees from mainland China with no place to live, with not enough food to go around, with not enough industry or jobs, and thinking about them looking 50 years forward, I dare say that the challenges that they faced then look a lot worse than the challenges we face now. We have the tools, we have the resources, we have all sorts of things at our disposal that they didn't have at their disposal, and yet, over 50 years, they put together a spectacular record of success. Imperfect as it is, they were able to get things done. So this is something that we need to keep in mind, because there's a story that's going to be told 50 years from now, and we hope the story is as good as the story of the last 50 years, because we're going to get things wrong, but the one thing that we need to be able to do is find ways to get them better, and get them better incrementally, get them better in big ways, and get them better in ways that actually serve the needs of everybody. But I think the principles are still there. The commitment is still there. And I think that there's many things that we can do to continue to learn from the experience of Taiwan to bring to the rest of the world through the ICLPST and through the work of the Lincoln Institute, who can bring this to the rest of the world in a different way. So I really thank you for participating in this all day today. I thank the researchers for all the work that you did, and I hope that we'll be able to hammer those papers into something that we can really do, share with so many of the other places in the world that need the tools that you need. We need to appreciate the willingness of Taiwan to use and try out different tools and different instruments when they needed them, and find ways to make them work, even if they didn't work perfectly, right? And we need to find ways to get others to be able to be willing to experiment and try and to make things better, even if they don't get it perfect. And I think that we'll be able to do that. So I thank you all. I thank the Center for putting together a magnificent event. I thank our MC, who did a fantastic job. And I hope that you're able to join us for the graduation ceremony that follows and the dinner. And I look forward to 50 years of success, 50 more years of success. So thank you very much.
Thank you, sir. Thank you, Dr. McCarthy, President and CEO of Lincoln Institute of Land Policy. Taiwan thanks you. We thank you. Once again, our applause. Dr. McCarthy. And we thank you, ladies and gentlemen, for joining us here today. And all of you are invited back tonight in 1 hour's time. Please come back at 6 p.m. for the banquet, the dinner party. For now, please bring your personal belongings. We must readjust the table. The hotel people will readjust the table, okay? So please come back at 6 p.m. for the dinner party. And we promise you, it's going to be fun tonight. It's going to be fun. We've got singing, we've got dancing, we've got celebrations for our 50th anniversary. Thank you. See you at 6. Thank you.